This week's Parsha Toldot tells us of a second famine that occurred in the land of Canaan. The first one happened soon after Avram had entered into the land at the beginning of Parshat Lech Lecha. Just as his father had done, Yitzchak also decided to migrate elsewhere for the duration of the famine. He started to travel and stopped in Gerar. But before he could proceed any further, God told him to stay put and not to go down to Egypt. From God's message to Yitzchak, it is pretty clear that Yitzchak was planning to continue down to Egypt as Avram had done. But why does God stop him from going down to Egypt? I might have thought that perhaps God just did not want Yitzchak to specifically go to Egypt. Even though Yitzchak had continued in Avraham's ways, Egypt perhaps might completely overwhelm him. Avraham had barely escaped from Egypt intact, and he was a man of the world, having grown up and lived in Mesopotamia and Assyria. Yitzchak, who grew up only in Canaan under Avraham and Sarah's watchful eyes, would have had no chance when exposed to Egypt. This initial thought, however, doesn't quite seem right. When Avram was looking for a wife for Yitzchak, he sent his servant back to Aram Naharaim and explicitly forbade him from taking Yitzchak with him. That would imply that the issue was not going to Egypt per se, but of not leaving Canaan. We can then say that God was merely honoring Avram's wishes of keeping Yitzchak in Canaan. Just as Avraham did not allow Yitzchak to leave Canaan, God too would not let Yitzchak leave Canaan. However, this does not answer why God or even Avraham wanted Yitzchak to stay in the land and not leave it at all. Why did they specifically want Yitzchak to stay put in the land? Rashi, quoting the Midrash Agadah, says that since Avraham consecrated Yitzchak at the Akedah to be a Korban Olah, Yitzchak was not allowed to leave the land. Mizrahi explains that just as an offering to God, once consecrated, may only stay within the confines of the Beit HaMikdash, so too by Yitzchak. Since Avram had consecrated Yitzchak to be an offering to God, even though in the end Yitzchak was not offered up, nevertheless he was still consecrated as such. Accordingly, the laws of offerings would then apply and required Yitzchak to stay within the confines of the land. Not everyone holds that the reason is due to Yitzchak's consecration. Shadal, for instance, says that God stopped Yitzchak from leaving the land for Egypt because he wanted to show Yitzchak that despite a famine in the land, Yitzchak will still be blessed and successful. And that is exactly what happens in the verses following God's appearance to Yitzchak. Perhaps so, there was another reason to ensure that Yitzchak did not leave the land, even for a moment. Yitzchak inherited the Abrahamic blessings. Part of the blessings was God's promise that the land will belong to Avraham and his descendants. With Avraham, the bond between him and the land was still tentative, as he had just received it. The true test would be for his descendants to remain in the land. As such, in order to ensure and solidify the bond between the family and the land, Yitzchak needed to remain in the land, never to leave it. It is true that in order to fulfill God's promise to Avraham at the Brit Ben HaBetarim, the whole family needed to leave the land in order to go to Egypt. But it could only happen after the bond between the family and the land had been firmly established. This occurred with Avram living most of his years in the land, Yitzchak always being in the land, and Yaakov spending most of his lifetime in the land. It should be noted that once the family and the nation left Egypt and came back to the land, throughout the millennia there has always been an Israelite presence somewhere in the land until this very day with the state of Israel, demonstrating that unbreakable bond between Israel and the land, showing that no other nation could truly claim the land for themselves. Shabbat Shalom.